Let's get more reaction to today's big tech hearings. Joining us now is the former chief security officer at Facebook, Alex Stamos. Alex, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
I know that you observed all of this, and I'll ask you the same question I asked the panel here. Did any company emerge from this injured in any way?
I'm not sure. I think what we're seeing is we're seeing kind of two different hearings layered on top of each other. From the Democrats' questioning, most of it was actually about antitrust. And I think in that area, there's a lot of legitimate complaints from the various representatives. The problem is that they're all very different, right? So the kind of antitrust concerns for these four different companies come from very different directions. They're talking about Amazon's use of its knowledge to compete in the physical world, of Apple and Google having platforms that they control, and of Facebook buying or copying competitors. And so, while all of them took some shots on it, I'm not sure there's any actual outcome for that. On the Republican side, it was mostly a litany of various complaints that they have about other policies that are completely irrelevant to antitrust. And from that side, I think it's going to get some sound bites for the various representatives, but there's not going to be any real outcome from them pushing on this.
So Alex, we just talked, there was a Democratic side, there was a Republican side, but isn't this antitrust battle that's coming for these tech behemoths here in the U.S. going to come most likely from the EU? We know that obviously there's been some dust kicked up there already, and isn't that what we would expect to see, how they fare, and then it comes back home to our shores?
Yeah, I think for the CEOs, if their biggest concern will be with EU regulation, specifically out of the competition, DG Comp, and investigations from that side, because a competition regulator is actually going to look at the impact of markets, which is something that you didn't hear anything about in this hearing, right? You heard very little about any actual harm to consumers, where the Europeans have a theory of the size of these companies harming European competitors and European consumers. And I think that's, in the long run, that's going to be much more effective than kind of having this litany of complaints that can't be solved with antitrust.
Do you think that sorry, it's Tim. Welcome and thanks for joining us. Do you think that there's any of these CEOs, no one wants an antitrust breakup, but a lot of people have pointed to that some of these companies are a lot more valuable based upon the sum of the parts. And how do you think these CEOs are thinking about that? Do you think any of them have contingency plans, or this really just gets into more of a corporate tactical strategy? But as we look at this as investors, I wouldn't find it catastrophic. In fact, I think it might be the opposite if DOJ really pushed hard.
It's an interesting question. Again, it's such a different issue with each company. I think in some cases, a breakup would at least change competition. So like the Facebook case, you could make Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp separate companies, and that might increase shareholder value over the long run to have them compete against one another. It might not. It's hard to make that prediction. But at least it's something that's a remedy to the kinds of complaints people have about Facebook. When you talk about Apple or Google, a breakup remedy doesn't really get you there, right? Like, it's not realistic to break Apple into multiple units that compete on iPhone. The issue there is their control of the App Store and whether or not they're using the App Store to suppress their competitors. Same thing with Google and their dominance in search. Like, there's no good way to break up Google's dominance in search. And so I think for those kinds of companies, the outcome could possibly be some kind of consent decree or another agreement that keeps them from utilizing their incredible power and the amount of data they have in competition. I think really the only company that probably should be worried about breaking up is Facebook, and maybe Amazon, although there's been very little discussion of the fact that Amazon is both a massive retailer and the world's largest cloud provider, which is something that's talked about a lot in tech and here in Silicon Valley that hasn't made it to the floor yet. But that is something that I think some regulators will look at.
But the bottom line, Alex, is do you think that all these guys go home, or maybe they are already home, and they just sort of think, wow, that was tough, but I'm glad I'm done, and life goes on. Nothing comes of it.
Yeah, I don't think any of these CEOs are worried from the outcome here. I'm always amazed at these hearings of the fact that the structure is so incredibly inefficient and is so poorly designed to actually nail down these folks. You're breaking it up into these 5-minute chunks for different representatives, and going back and forth between Republican and Democrat means that you have no consistency in the questioning, that you're talking about actual competition issues, and the moment you get somewhere interesting, it's over. And now you're talking about, oh, this guy got taken down on Twitter, and Twitter's not even there, right? Like, all these complaints about Twitter, who isn't even represented, is one of the silly things that's going on right now. And so I think if they want these hearings to be more effective, they're going to need to find a model where somebody who actually knows what they're talking about is spending 15 or 20 minutes asking questions that are actually based upon reality, not this kind of litany of political issues for which they want to get sound bites.
Right, and then the ping-ponging between the CEOs is very disruptive. Alex, great to have you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Alex Stamos.
Thank you.
It's a dog and pony show. I mean, let's put it straight, right? Let's just call it what it is, right? And at the same time, if we get at some of the remedies that could be proposed, which company would be the most scathed? Which would be the least, Guy?
I think remedies, the most, potentially the most one hurt, I would think Facebook, and I think the least one hurt would be Apple, just back of the envelope stuff. I mean, maybe you can argue on the Facebook, but I think it seems to me that Apple's probably the most impervious to any of this, my opinion.
Yeah, Tim, what do you say?
Well, Apple seems to me with the App Store and the complaints from the developers and the complaints from people like Spotify, we heard the CEO after the bell. I mean, that to me seems the most vulnerable. And I think Apple, and if you look at their revenue and you look at the services revenue, we've thrown, and I've heard Dan talk about this too, to the extent that we've thrown so much in terms of a fresh multiple at Apple on services, that seems to be the place where ultimately, look, the competitive environment is such where an efficient market should settle that score. It hasn't so far. I think Apple remains under pressure.
Yeah. Bonneman, what do you think?
You know what? I think just in terms of revenue attribution, I believe the App Store is only about 10% of Apple's overall revenue. So while there may be a higher probability that thing becomes a headline issue, in terms of the overall business mix, I would think that in fact they're the least affected. Amazon, to me, seems like there's a bit of an issue there, at least from a headline risk. Facebook has kind of already been through the ringer, and I think they've kind of been, for lack of a better word, exposed or pressured. From Amazon's point of view, keeping data and then using that to change the competitive landscape, I think that's something that could be probed a bit more, and that they're going to have to provide some pretty logical explanations and answers for.
It was interesting how Bezos came out. He was the first CEO to start his testimony, and he came out saying who he was, telling his story. He was the child of a high school almost dropout, a teen mom, et cetera, got adopted by the whole 9 yards. It was a very convincing story, Dan. Mm-hmm. And from the richest man, perhaps on the planet at this point, it was probably a smart move.
Listen, Bezos is the GOAT. There's no doubt about it. And he's the least likely. It's just a fact.
That's greatest of all time, Guy.
Yeah, Guy. His business is the least likely. Go ahead and try to spin out AWS, and all of a sudden you're going to have a top 10 NASDAQ 100 company on your hands that's just going to steamroll everybody else anyway. So, to me, I don't think there's a strong likelihood that company gets broken up. If anything, even with Facebook, when you think about it, the discussion about Instagram back in 2012, it was a no revenue company for $1 billion. Well, what's happened? We've seen Facebook's proper, vertical kind of move over to Instagram. And Instagram has a lot of risk right now. Mark Zuckerberg, we talked about it last night, and he mentioned it today. TikTok is the real deal here, and it's coming after them. And then when you have upstarts like Snapchat, which is a $2 billion revenue company, but that commands a lot of mind share among teams, you have to be worried, teens that is. You have to be worried. So to me, Facebook is the one that I think posed with the most risk. And listen, we didn't even talk about trust and safety yet. That is the grievance of the Republicans in some ways, is just kind of the, the pushing their voices down to the side. The Democrats have a real argument on the trust and safety, and if there's any ill-toward action on that platform that affects our election in the fall, they're coming for Facebook with the pitchforks there.